All right, good afternoon. I was just mentioning that I am new here at UMMA, about 6 months, and I originally hailed from New York City. Have any of you been on the New York City subway? Okay, just as a point of reference, because I went up to the beautiful exhibit this afternoon, and it felt like the New York City subway. It's so packed with joyous people. Just really a wonderful, wonderful moment. So I want to welcome you here and hope that you will enjoy this program on the occasion of the exhibition, the Power Family Program for Inuit Art. Tiddlangikuk. That's the best I can do. You're going to hear much better.
There.
That's not bad, not bad.
Tiddlingangittuk.
Tiddlingangikuk. Okay, we're all going to be experts at pronouncing this name at the end of this exhibition. The exhibition inaugurates the Power Family Program for Inuit Art, established in 2018 through the generosity of the Philip and Kathy Powers, and has been curated by Mame Jackson, with key consultant Patricia Feheley, who we will have the pleasure of hearing from shortly. I want to thank Philip and Kathy Power, who is not with us today, but she's a great part of this power couple. I want to thank them for their commitment to Inuit art and to this community and to UMMA. This afternoon's program is our 2019 Doris Sloan Memorial Program. Established through the generosity of Dr. Herbert Sloan, the annual Doris Sloan Memorial Program celebrates UMMA's collection in honor of one of the museum's most ardent friends and supporters, Doris Sloan, a longtime UMMA docent. And I can tell you a big part of the energy here today is coming from the huge family of UMMA docents, and I thank you. Today we'll hear from Mame and Pat about the works in the exhibition, what you've been seeing glide through on this screen, and learn about the development and subsequent worldwide acclaim of contemporary Inuit art from the Canadian Arctic. We'll also discuss the Power family's seminal role in supporting Inuit art and introducing it to a U.S. audience. 70 years ago, neither the Inuit artists nor the Power family could have foreseen the tremendous popularity that this work would come to enjoy. Taking its title from the Inuktitut word for unexpected, this stirring exhibition showcases 58 works from the collection of Philip and Kathy Power. Most from the very early contemporary period of the 1950s and 1960s. Included are exquisite sculptures of ivory, bone, and stone, as well as stone-cut and stencil prints, some from the first annual Inuit print collection in 1959. Among the renowned Inuit artists featured in this historic survey are renowned artists that I'm going to leave to Mame and Pat to properly pronounce their names. And there will be a discussion following their presentation, and then there'll be time for Q&A with you. So at the conclusion of the formal program, we're going to invite you to join us upstairs for refreshments and an opportunity to browse the exhibition once more if you have not been there for the first time. And the rest of the galleries, I'm sad to say, are closed today, but access to the gallery by taking the elevator to the first floor or via the stairs at the back of the ground floor. So just follow the crowds as you exit. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Mame Jackson, Pat Feheley, Patricia Feheley, let me say, and Philip Power. So just a bit about each of them. Mame Jackson is an art historian and professor emerita of Wayne State University and the University of Michigan. She's also taught at the Federal University of Bahia in Salvador, Brazil, and Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And at Carleton, she offered courses in the history of Inuit art as part of the university's new graduate program in Canadian art history. Jackson first encountered Inuit art as a teenager on a family vacation in Montreal, And her interest in Inuit art evolved into serious study when she was a graduate student in art history at the University of Michigan. And in 1985, she became the first person to write a doctoral dissertation on contemporary Inuit art. Jackson's research focuses on the interaction between cultures and on the visual arts as they reflect, examine, and shape cultural expression. She has studied artistic traditions in the Americas, concentrating primarily on rich cultural traditions outside the widely studied Euro-American mainstream. And in this connection, she has focused on indigenous art of the Americas, particularly Inuit art, and visiting the Canadian Arctic 15 times between 1975 and 1995, and art of the African diaspora in the Americas, particularly African Brazilian art, visiting the northeast of Brazil more than 20 times between 1992 and 2018. Jackson has organized or collaborated in the organization of more than a dozen exhibitions, including 4 internationally traveling exhibitions of Inuit art, 2 of which were shown at UMMA. And she's written many exhibition catalogs and articles and has lectured widely on Inuit art and culture and on the influence of Africa and the visual arts of the Americas. She's received numerous grants and awards, including a Fulbright Senior Scholar Fellowship to Brazil and grants from the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities, the Michigan Council for the Humanities, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Ministry for Culture and Tourism, States of Bahia, Joyce Foundation. I can go on and on, Mame. Well, this is just fantastic. I just also want to say that she's also the co-founder and co-director of Convida, Popular Arts in the Americas, a nonprofit organization incorporated in 2000 to promote understanding and appreciation for the diverse cultures of the Americas through their popular or vernacular art. She's also quite active in Detroit, and she's co-founder of Arts Corp Detroit, a community-based program engaging Wayne State University students and others in collaborative arts and projects revitalizing Detroit's neighborhoods. Let's give it up for Mame Jackson's stellar background.
Thank you.
Patricia Feheley is the power behind this show. And she's the owner and longtime director of the Feheley Fine Arts, a Toronto art gallery specializing in early and contemporary Inuit art. In addition to being an art dealer, she's an art historian, specializing in the field of Canadian Inuit art with an extensive educational and administrative background in the visual arts. And from her first trip to Cape Dorset in the late 1960s to over 4 decades of traveling in the Canadian Arctic, Feheley has developed firsthand knowledge of the contemporary arts in Inuit communities. She has championed well-known Inuit artists. Once again, Pat,
okay.
I'm going to leave the names to you.
I'll get to it. Yeah.
And she's an acknowledged expert in the primary and secondary market for Inuit art. She provides appraisals as well as collections management and curatorial consultation services to both corporate and private art collections. Past president of the Art Dealers Association of Canada, Feheley has represented the country's leading artists via the major private and commercial galleries of Canada. And she's currently serving on the board of the Inuit Art Foundation and serves on the Canadian Cultural Properties Review Board. She holds an honors bachelor's degree in art history from Queen's University, a master's degree in museology and art history from the University of Toronto. And Feheley travels to the Canadian Arctic several times a year, primarily to Cape Dorset and other settlements on Baffin Island in Nunavut. And she also travels to and shows works by artists from the other 3 territories of the Inuit Nunavut. So let's give it up for Pat Feheley. And lastly, Phil Power. For nearly 40 years, Phil Power was founder, owner, and chairman of the board of Hometown Communications Network, Inc., a group of 62 community newspapers and 24 telephone directories throughout Michigan and around Cincinnati, Ohio. Initially an entrepreneurial effort, the corporation came to be recognized as among the very best of its sort in the country, while at the same time retaining its roots as a family company. Taken together, his newspapers won more than state and national awards for excellence than any other group in the country. In March of 2005, Phil Power sold the assets of his company to the Gannett Company, and his award-winning column continues to appear regularly in the former newspapers. Mr. Power founded in January 2006 the Center for Michigan, a think and do tank aimed at improving the policy and political environment in Michigan. And it publishes Bridge Magazine, a free online publication with more than 1.6 million readers. He was appointed a regent of the University of Michigan in 1987. He was elected to office in 1990, winning more than 1 million votes statewide. And he led the effort to rewrite the University of Michigan rules governing the technology transfer from university laboratories into the commercial world. And as a result, applications for patents, new company startups, and IPOs by the University of Michigan faculty and staff increased markedly. He was defeated for re-election in 1998, and he received the Distinguished Alumni Service Award for the University of Michigan Alumni Association in October 2000. A bit more. From 1983 to 1990, Mr. Power chaired the Michigan Job Training Coordination Council and was a primary advisor to Governor Blanchard on human investment and job training. In 2000, Governor Engler appointed him to the Executive Committee of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, where he served as vice chairman. In 1991, Mr. Power helped found the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce, a non-for-profit organization that helps communities, states, employers, and others achieve world-class workforce development systems. And he served as chairman from 1991 through 2005. Phil Power also served on the board of directors of Jacobson Stores, Inc. and Sensi Tech Technologies, and he served 5 years as chair of Michigan chapter of the Nature Conservatory and as president of the Power Foundation. He also was a member of the board of the University Musical Society in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he was awarded an honorary degree, Doctor of Public Service by Eastern Michigan University in 2003. Mr. Power graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Michigan in 1960. He was editorial director of the student newspaper, the Michigan Daily, and a member of the Americans Committed to World Responsibility, a student organization that proposed volunteer service abroad, the original version of the idea taken up by John F. Kennedy as the Peace Corps. In 1962, he received a Marshall Scholarship to study at Oxford University, England, where he received an MA in philosophy, politics, and economics. And as one of his highlighted achievements in life, he's married to Kathleen K. Power. They have 2 sons, Scott Sutton, MD, who practices internal medicine in Denver, and Nathan E. Power, who's just moved back from Shanghai, China, to the US. And just a little bit about Phil's relationship with the Inuit of Cape Dorset and Baffin Island. Phil Power's father, Eugene Power, James Houston, and Philip founded in 1959 Eskimo Art, Inc., a nonprofit corporation to promote, distribute, and sell Inuit art in the U.S. art market. For a period, this group, EAI, was the primary source of Inuit artifacts in the U.S. And upon his father's death, Philip and his wife Kathy shut down the company because it had achieved its purpose. Control and management of Inuit art products is now entirely in the hands of the Inuit themselves. Philip revisited Baffin Island with his family in the summer of 1959 and again in April of 2014. Let's give it up for the man who's given us this great gift and this program. Thank you, Phil Power. Now we'll begin our program.
The program from here is going to begin with a short slideshow that Pat and I will use to introduce you to the Arctic, to Cape Dorset, to the art, and give you some context for the work that it sounds like many of you have seen from the New York subway recently. I want to just add a personal note. There are a lot of old friends, and I want to thank UMMA and Phil for bringing me back into this project, and Pat for being a wonderful collaborator. And at a time we're celebrating a wonderful gift to the University of Michigan. So at a personal level, thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to you all for creating this event of celebration. Vera stumbled a little over Tili Nangitak, and I want to give you all a little lesson so it doesn't happen to you when you're in some public situation. So this is the Inuktitut word that means, as it says at the bottom, something unexpected, something that wasn't known before, a surprise, something not totally anticipated. And on the right, or on your left, on the left side of the slide is a set of syllabic symbols. The Inuktitut language is written in phonetic symbols that were developed actually initially for Cree by missionaries, but have been adapted by the Inuit for the written expression of their language. So on the top of the slide in Inuktitut, it says Tili Nangituk. Now, that might still sound a little complicated and a little long, but it's not that bad if you break it down. Twips. This part, the first part, is here. A double L is pronounced as a D. So, titty. Try it. Titty. Okay, that means expected. The second affix in this word, nungi, pronounced nangi, means negative or not. So, titty nungi. Titty nungi. Once more, titty nungi. Okay, and then we'll add the final syllable, tuk, which is an easy one, and it just means it is, or it's something unexpected. So, titty nungi tuk. Titty nungi tuk. Titty nungi tuk. You've got it. You'd be surprised how often you'll use it. So now that you've got a little language, let's get a little geography in place. And we're talking today about the Canadian Arctic, and particularly the Eastern Arctic, this area, sorry, I'm getting these buttons a little bit confused. This area marked on this map in green, you can kind of see that it's around the Hudson Bay here. The Canadian Eastern Central Arctic, which in 1999 became Canada's newest territory, Nunavut. Nunavut has a population of about 36,000 people. That will be the area that we're talking about this afternoon, with a particular emphasis on this place right here, Kingite, which means mountains in Inuktitut, or Cape Dorset, which was what it was known when Phil and Pat and I all started going up there. But when Nunavut became a territory and under native rule, local rule, the names that were actually the original Inuit names of communities were readopted as the names of the communities. So Kingite is the Inuktitut name. It describes the territory of kind of a mountainous area, and it is Cape Dorset. Now, just to kind of position ourselves a little bit, the Canadian Arctic has been inhabited continuously for at least 4,000 years, from the the coast of Alaska to the coast of Greenland. It has been populated for approximately 4,000 years, with a migration across from west to east, beginning around 4,000 years ago, or perhaps a little earlier, and then going through a series of different cultural periods, and I'll come to those in a minute. And these are the ancestors of the present-day Inuit. And to give you a little introduction to them, Much of this, of course, is a prehistoric, unrecorded area of history. The pre-Dorset area, and you can just give a few artifacts, is known really only through artifacts and through archaeological speculation. It began around 2000, before the Common Area, around 4,000 years ago, and continued for 1,200 years or so, and then in situ developed into the Dorset culture. The reason people can tell the differences is there are differences in locations, difference in material culture. And what I'm trying to show you here is not something I expect you to particularly remember, but maybe get in your mind, because some of the aspects, like this, what seems to be a kind of tattooed face, a small piece of ivory, and this is a small piece of ivory with markings, incised markings in the ivory, or this bear from the Dorset culture. Remember, if you've been upstairs, you know there are prominently bears in the exhibition upstairs. Bears have been a part, even in this prehistoric culture, of the artifacts that are known. And then the Thule culture, which developed around 1,000 about 1,000 Common Era, and it represented a kind of a warming time in the culture when there was a turning to more sea hunting, and whales became more prevalent, so that these three prehistoric cultural periods have been identified by archaeologists. The historic period in the Arctic really began, well, it really began with voyages of exploration, most of them British, the first one being Martin Frobisher in the late 1500s, and then during particularly the 1800s, a number of voyages of exploration looking for the Northwest Passage. And then during the 19th century, the Arctic became a place where whalers came in, missionaries came in, traders began to come in, and at that time there was really a more consistent, still somewhat isolated, but a more consistent contact for the Inuit people with these outsiders who were coming into their territory. For the previous voyages of exploration, those are pretty much isolated events and had very little impact on very few Inuit. But during the time of the coming of the missionaries, the traders, and the whalers, there was quite a bit more contact, and the Inuit came to know and actually to desire some of the materials that were available from these traders: ammunition, tobacco, molasses, things that made their lives more comfortable and easier, and they traded objects that they could make, like this cribbage board on the bottom with these tiny little figures. Now notice again, this is ivory, the tiny little carved and very lively animated little figures, or this is another ivory piece with an incised pictorial design. The whalers themselves were doing scrimshaw, and there was a kind of mutual appreciation back and forth. But all through this historic period, there was some amount of trade work, and it was primarily ivory, three-dimensional figures like these little figures attached to this cribbage board, and pictorial work, incised works. By the beginning of the 20th century, the trade effects were well known in the Inuit culture. These are images from a winter hunting camp and a summer hunting camp, a skin tent in the summer, still primarily living off the land and from the animals that they hunted. But you can see in this, there's a little Primus stove here, and there's a bucket, and there's a pan. There's some actual fabric. It isn't all skins that have made that tent. So that there is a kind of influx of some trade goods, which would have been achieved by maybe trading objects like I just showed you, or by this time also pelts, white fox pelts, so that the Inuit by then were hunters and trappers. By the 1940s, there were some challenges to that traditional way of life, and I've just listed them here. One was a change in the migration patterns of the animals that were hunted, which diminished the food supply for the Inuit. One was a collapse, worldwide collapse in the sale of white fox. The white fox market went down, and that really, the white fox was their primary means for trading for some of these goods that I was mentioning to you. So that collapsed. Also, disease had become a very, very difficult problem, particularly tuberculosis that had been introduced by whalers and traders and people who brought into the Inuit communities germs that they didn't have antibodies to protect themselves from. And then eventually the Inuit were moving closer to services, like trading stations and so forth, moving away from their semi-nomadic summer camps and winter camps to be closer to government services, which during the 1950s and into the 60s were provided, well, late 1940s even, were provided, and they would be closer around these small communities. And as they grew into these small communities, they were no longer able to support themselves for the most part by hunting. You need small, nimble communities of 20 or 30 or 40 at the most to be able to live as a hunting culture. And as people came in together in larger settlements, it was no longer possible to depend totally on the animals that they hunted. So this created a problem, an economic problem. And into this, and here's a Tilly Nungituk moment, into this artist, the Canadian artist Jim Houston, who had been in the Second World War and was an artist. And he was sketching one summer, 1948, down here in the James Bay area, and he had what he called the winds of chance, brought him the opportunity to take a hitchhike on a medical flight up here along the east coast of the Hudson Bay. So he went to a place called Inukjuak, and he was an artist, and he was sketching, and and the people were interested in what he was sketching, and he'd give them to them. He'd give them copies of the drawings he had made of themselves or their grandchildren, and they liked them. And they began giving him objects back, small carvings in ivory or soapstone. And he was so enchanted by those carvings that at the end of that summer, in 1948, he took those carvings back to, really sorry, Tilly Nungituk, back to Montreal, to the Canadian Guild of Crafts, and showed them as a sample of what he thought the Inuit could do, what he knew the Inuit could do, and what he was excited about. And the Canadian Guild of Crafts, the Hudson Bay Company, and the federal government kind of came together and created a plan for one thing, sending Houston back along the east coast of the Hudson Bay, kind of up in this area, the northern Hudson Bay, and over here a little bit on the western coast, over the next few years. And during that time, he collected for shipment back. He worked out arrangements for these carvings to be sent back to Montreal, and worked through the Hudson Bay Company to purchase those and to send them back. And that became the beginning of Inuit art. And it was very popular. I mean, immediately, those first sales sold out. It was very popular. But now, Canada, the second largest country in the world, then, as it does now, had a population about 1/10 the population of the United States. So that when Houston, who went back to Baffin Island, here's Baffin Island up here, and here's Cape Dorset right over here on this corner, went back with his family and spent 8 years as a federal northern officer. He encouraged the continued creation of works of art. He encouraged people to move from ivory to stone, which was more easily accessible and actually allowed more flexibility in creation. And so he was there, and it was called back at one point, 1953, to deal with the issue of how can we ensure a market. How can we ensure beyond the borders of Canada? This was already popular in Canada, and it was getting a reputation around the world. But how can we increase the market for that? And Houston came back and came to the United States, 10 times the population of Canada, and visited some museums, but also visited Phil's father, Phil's family, Eugene Power, who immediately saw the possibility of opening a market in the United States and began the nonprofit Eskimo Art Incorporated, and through that made Eskimo art available in the United States, and also worked with some really important institutions like the Smithsonian to circulate tours of Inuit art exhibitions around the United States, enlarging the population and audience that was familiar with it, and along with those exhibitions, offering sales opportunities so that Inuit art became very popular in the United States, and Ann Arbor, one of the centers for that. Now, that's a bit of background. I'm going to pass this little gadget over to Pat. Hope she can operate it better than I can. And she will take you to Cape Dorset. And here's what it looks like flying over that rocky southern coast of Baffin Island.
Okay, so Mame has just covered 4,000 years. I'm here to, sorry, excuse my voice, I'm sorry. I'm here to cover 60 years, in fact, but a very active 60 years. So we're going to concentrate on King Knight and on the development of what is known as contemporary Inuit art. Now, obviously, in the urge to find an economic replacement for subsistence hunting, stone carving was obvious. They had ivory from narwhal tusks and walrus tusks, and they had caribou antler, and of course a lot of local soapstone. So that became that was an obvious change, that they had been carving tools forever. What you're going to see upstairs primarily is this incredible flowering of the 50s and primarily the early 60s. So it's more of a point-in-time exhibition. And this was a time when, for instance, this Niviaxiac sedna that you see on the screen right now, it was a time, first of all, when they were still going back and forth between camp and settlement. And so you were not going to do a giant piece. You'd have to, something that would be very small, that would be easy to transport. In this case, it's a mythical figure. It's Sedna, the sea goddess, who's the one who sends the seals. And a really interesting thing about these early works is that, in fact, it's totally carved. And if you pick up a piece of a kneeling woman, you'll see that underneath her legs are delineated, because Sananguaq at that point, you were making a likeness. And if you're making a likeness, you finish the whole thing. You don't leave. So you can see underneath her. They're screening a film here called The Living Stone. And if you watch it, I think it's being screened continuously. Yeah. If you watch it, you can actually watch this piece being made in the course of the film. So I highly recommend that you do that. These are two other examples from the same time, both of mothers and children. I just wanted to show that there was, although they were working with, at this point, very primitive implements, files, and that sort of thing, again, when you go upstairs, it's not as evident. Mame was really good with this pointer thing there. How delicately her braids have been carved. So, I mean, the craftsmanship was stunning. And it wasn't necessarily all realistic. The artist who's on the right, the PC Oshwitu, Mother and Child, is from the same time period. There's two pieces by him upstairs. But in fact, they're very abstracted in a way. They're very contemporary and kind of minimalist. And so even at this time, you were getting, some artists were actually, they weren't just making a likeness. They were in fact, putting in their own kind of artistic statement. But, carving, as I said, was not necessarily, that wasn't as a surprise. The surprise was printmaking. And it was Jim Houston who introduced it. He had just thought that it might be something that could be cooperatively done. And so he got the government to send him to Japan to study woodcut printing and the whole studio. And in that case, it's a very cooperative process. Somebody does the image, someone else carves the block, someone else prints the block, or the carver may print the block. So the first collection came out in 1959. By 1961, which is when this shot was taken, this entire group of artists were creating images for the prints. And among these artists were, all the artists that you'll see upstairs, Lucy, Hanoyuak, Par, Lukta, and you can see one of the stone blocks. So how they did this was, as soon as people started coming into the settlement, they asked them to make drawings. Jim initially, and then Terry Ryan, who took over, and they paid them for the drawings. And so some people loved it and were happy to do it, like Kanoyuak. Others tried one and it didn't really resonate with them. But the co-op would buy them, and those drawings became the image bank for the prints. So you see here Kanoyuak actually in the outpost camp making a drawing. And they would select the drawings for printing. In this case, Niviaxiak, who did the little Sedna I told you, you can see in the film, was a great hunter. And so someone, I presume Jim, gave him a sketchbook. And he was out on the land and he sketched all of these things. But you know, if you look at just this image here, this will show you how they chose. So it actually, you can see that they really did come right from the drawings, not necessarily from the whole sheet, but you know, they would come in on things. And this is a stencil print, which is why it's so beautifully mottled, that beautiful kind of variegated blue. But what they developed there, which is, and that's, sorry, this is stencil printing, which I think we all did in kindergarten, where you just sort of stamp things. They often combine stencil and stone cut, but the thing that was very unique to the Canadian Arctic and remains unique is stone cut printing. So you can see on the upper left, the printer is actually cutting the design. They trace the image on the stone. He cuts it out. You can see on the right, he's rolling it. And then on the lower left, putting the sheet down, and on the lower right, pulling the print. And they had very good advice. They pulled only 50 prints from predominantly and destroyed the matrix, following International Print Convention rules, which was very important eventually for marketing, in fact. So this was pretty unique to there. And you can see this is a shot from the 1961 studio. You can see the pieces of stone. At this point, they were just going out on the land and finding flat stone. In a territory without trees, wood was pretty precious, so they weren't going to do woodcuts. But they did have a lot of stone. And you can just see peeking in right up there, just the nose of Lucy's bear, which is upstairs on view. So this is Cape Dorset around this time. Cape Dorset around the time that Phil would have visited there. He was there in '59. And what I've just shown you is the beginnings. This is the original West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative Limited, which was established by the government wing, and the studios came in underneath that. And this is today. The buildings that you see that are all green with the red roofs are all of the co-op buildings. And so on the right is the drawing studio, the lithograph studio. On the left was the stone cutting studio and the offices. And the co-op also made itself financially secure. It opened a store so that the printing shops were always protected financially. They weren't dependent on government, which is also very important. Those studios, the King Knight studios today, are the oldest printing studios in Canada, and arguably in North America, but we haven't been able to prove that yet. So it was remarkable that this little co-op in this little town was able to protect these studios for so long. So now this is today. This is a drawing by one of the younger artists, and this is their brand new Kanoyuak Cultural Center, which opened this year. And it has state-of-the-art printing studios, drawing studios, but it also has a cultural center for exhibition of art and for gatherings. And it's fitting that it opened this year because this is the 60th anniversary of the first Dorset collection to come out. The first collection was 1959, and you'll see prints upstairs from 1959. And so I'm just going to try and quickly, I don't want to go on for too long, but just try and bring you up through what's been happening since. Because it's not, now what is the same is I took these pictures in November. That's just like what you saw from 1960. There's, Hyatsu cutting the block. There's the block ready to print. There's Havavau actually inking it and pressing the paper down. So in 60 years, more than actually, this same thing is still going on, and people still line up at my door for the Dorset release, which is the third week in October every year. But what's accompanied this over the last, particularly 15 or 20 years, has been some remarkable changes. Kanoyuak, you see here, drawing in her outpost camp. You can see the teapot behind. And here's Shuvanaia Shuna last November, lying on top of her 4x8 foot drawing, 1 foot up in the air, and just happily drawing away in the new drawing studio. And over the last 15 to 20 years in particular, the artists began to realize that the drawings they've been doing to sell to the co-op looked like the prints, and the prints looked like the drawings. And then there was an aha moment where some of them started to draw what they wanted to draw. And this just started an incredible whole new wave. So one of the most exciting things happening today in the art in Cape Dorset is the drawing program. So for instance, this is a Shuvanaia Shuna. You can see she brought in landscape, which you would not get in prints. And every day, this is somebody people unloading a truck. So it's not about myth, it's not about traditional life. Annie Pudugu really broke it wide open. This is watching Dr. Phil on TV with a half-eaten cookie and a cup of coffee beside her. And this is what the interior of homes look like now. Annie also, there was a brand new freezer, this huge freezer at the co-op. So this was the first large-scale drawing to come out, because this was 4x8. And it was just, again, as I say, what you see in the settlement. She said she couldn't draw about older things because that's not the life she lived. The life she lived, she grew up in the settlement. So this just, as I say, broke it wide open. This is Jutai Tunu, who's a fabulous artist who had never been interested in drawing, but because of this came into the studio. And they brought in new media. This is Jutai doing, he actually laid down on this piece of paper and had somebody draw his silhouette. And then covered it. And he's working an oil stick. Tim Pitsiulak, doing actually his first oil stick drawing. He predominantly worked in pencil crayon. But what's on the board there are actually images of whales swimming taken off the internet. So he's watching how they swim. Eventually he got a GoPro and was able to put it down in the water. And in the National Gallery of Canada, there's actual drawing of these seals swimming around and his GoPro right there in the drawing. Shuv and I really liked to mix it up, so she would do round ones. She actually did three-dimensional ones. She drew she drew in a box once. And then you got to, this is the largest scale drawing and the very first important commission for an Inuit artist. This is Tim again. The sheets of paper they have up there are 4x8, and this is 8x12. So he took 2 4x8 sheets and actually managed to do this drawing, joining them in the middle at the end. I was actually there when he was finishing it, and he had left the center and was just, making it come together. So to give you an idea of how radical it changed this was, this is Hotak Ashuna, an elder. He had a print in the 1961 collection. He was drawing in the 60s. When he retired as janitor of the high school, all these 30 years later, he continued to draw the way he did before, which was small vignettes. And then he turned into a color field artist. So literally in his lifetime, he saw this change. And you can see, again, the scale and the way that he's putting that together. So drawing is a major part of it now. And just, again, very quickly, sculpture, I just want to bring a little bit up to date because I will have words for that later. But the sculpture changed as well, different materials. This is actually Brazilian soapstone. This is not a Cape Dorset artist. But talking about the shaman crash landing, which refers to the loss of culture. This is a very recent piece. A lot of mixed media now. These are traditional snow goggles, which have little slits, traditionally made out of bone. These are made out of sterling silver and have muskox horn at the end. And then finally, what's really informed from the 1980s, 90s on, is the global, a global interest because of television coming up. And this is Uvalu Tunili. I went up north a week after 9/11, and she brought a sculpture over to me and said, and it was a grieving woman. This is one of a series that she did, and it was grieving for the orphans who were left behind, or the children who were left without parents after the World Trade Center disaster. So there are a lot of different influences. When you look upstairs at the pieces I showed earlier, it will be more about traditional life, about myths and legends, but it has moved on and changed, which does not mean that it is better, because what you're going to see upstairs is exquisite. Anyway, more about that later. I am now going to hand this back to Mame.
Pat and I thought we would end up with each picking out a couple of pieces that we were responding to for one reason or another, and just responding to them for you. Something I'd like you to encourage you to do too. Pick out something that moves you or interests you, and think about it a bit. What I chose were a few bear images. As you know from my earlier remarks, bear figured prominently all through the prehistoric period in terms of artifacts that were found. These two bears, the small ivory one, if you've been up there, you might have noticed one of the small ivory pieces. Just you could hold it in your hand, and then the larger stone bear. But both of them, to me, very animated, very carefully observed, a sense of movement. I mean, you can feel the gravity tip forward in both of those bears, and particularly in the stone bear in the front. They come from, I think, an amazing sense of observation. They come from a hunting culture where the animals were central to that culture, where the people observed the animals and felt one with the animals, where there was really a sense of the interaction between human and animal life, where where everything in the Inuit culture had a spirit. The spirit of the bear Nanook, it was the king of the bears, admired for its strength, for its inquisitiveness, for its patience, admired for a lot of common qualities in human beings. And so there was a kind of an association that humans and bears made. And in fact, in the Inuit culture was the sense that every animal, every person, even the weather itself, has a spirit. And the spirit of the bear, the Inua, the spirit of the bear, was something that Pat was talking about this, that the spirit is as much the identity as the physical animal itself. And there was, in the early culture, people, I think, still are conditioned by a way of thinking that comes out of traditional culture, even though the culture has changed and is changing rapidly. But the sense of the dependence of human beings on nature, the sense of human beings on the animals that they hunted, underlay a number of sort of rituals in the hunting culture, where when an animal was hunted and killed by the hunter, there were certain ritual recognitions or a sense of respect that needed to be paid to that animal. For the bears, it was giving of gifts. It was giving of hunting tools to male bears. It was a giving of needle cases and women's tools and ulu to the female bears. For the seal, it was a cup of fresh water in return for the animal giving up his life, her life, to the hunter, was the respect for the soul, and the idea was that would continue on, and you treat that with respect. There was an understanding in the culture that if you didn't treat a bear with respect, that bear spirit would go off and tell other bears not to come to you. But if you treated that bear with respect, that bear would carry the good news, and you would continue to be successful in the hunt. Hunters would continue to come to you because you understood and you respected that animal. And thinking a little about our own culture, and in this time of global warming and shrinking polar ice, which is having a dramatic effect on the habitat of polar bears, our scientists are saying something akin to what the Inuit wisdom was. If you don't respect the bears will go away and they won't come back. And I, with that, pass it to you.
Thank you. So I chose this piece, first of all, because I love it. I think it's fabulous. It's small, as I said earlier. A lot of them were very small. But another thing that you'll notice when you're upstairs and with the others is they very often used inlay, in this case for her face, and also the ulu, the implement in her left hand is the woman's knife, which was a semicircular knife. And they used that for everything from skinning to sewing to eating. That was specifically a woman's knife. Men would not use it at all. But in the search for wanting to make things real, for making a likeness, then they would often put these inset amounts, and it's painstaking work. And I don't know if you can see, but there's actually inlay in and around. Let's see if I can find this along there. They've actually inlaid clay just to sort of make more detail. Another interesting thing, though, is that we did say printmaking was, Houston introduced it and it came and it was new, but they've been making graphic images for many, many years, going right back to the prehistoric pieces that Mame showed you, where in fact there was incised lines on the old bear, particularly in the historic period when they were the whalers were showing them scrimshaw, and you'll see some great examples upstairs of them making, using a whole ivory tusk. But for the women who actually dominated to a great degree printmaking, it was the tattoo marks on the faces, and also they made beautiful inlaid clothing. They would use dark and light sealskin and make patterns in clothing. So this is like almost a graphic antecedent to the printmaking. And then finally, this is the last piece in the show, and it is a contemporary piece. And it is a magnificent example of where the sculpture has gone. Silas Kipanak, is a hunter. And I'm not sure if he's actually killed whales, because I don't know him personally. But what is important here is not the realistic depiction of a whale, of a narwhal. What's important here is the aesthetic of the piece. It's about the essence of the narwhal and the playfulness of the narwhal. And so he's not trying to depict, as I say, every little detail. What you get is an incredibly dynamic image. None of the contemporary artists have left behind traditional culture, nor have they left behind their lifestyle, since everybody, if you're in Cape Dorset on a Sunday, everybody will be out hunting. And if the narwhal come through or the beluga come through, everybody will be out hunting. So it's still a major part of their lives. But this is the forward-looking piece, and sort of where it has gone from the early 1950s and early 60s, magnificent pieces in the Power collection that is upstairs. And Nakramik, which is thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What an extraordinary story that you share with us, both the history and the movements that were made in current contemporary art. What came ringing so clearly to me is your passion for having worked in this area and the deep respect that you have for the community that you've been working with. So it's just really wonderful to hear that story and the multiply embedded stories that are clearly within it. And I think right now I would love to hear a bit from you, Phil, because you had your own story of passion and respect and your own kind of intentions and desires from this engagement. Can you share with us your favorite story of this encounter, perhaps, or maybe a favorite piece? Please share something with us.
Let me tell you three brief stories. The first has to do with the very first time the notion of starting Eskimo Art Incorporated was talked about when Jim Houston and his wife Alma came down to see my parents and me in Ann Arbor. And Jim had brought with him several quite beautiful stone carvings. And he made the economic point that here we had in the current Inuit an artistic tradition whose roots go back several thousand years, but has been now brought into contemporary meaning. But at that time, the issue was expressed in economic terms. And the issue had to do with where do you get the cash in order to survive as an Inuit family in the middle part of the 20th century in the Arctic. And so you need the cash to buy the cartridges for your rifles. You need the cash to buy the tea. You need the cash in order to buy the pots and pans at the Hudson's Bay store. And so the question came about, how are Inuit people going to earn a cash income which helps them live their lives in an Inuit way, and is consistent with their culture? Because at that time, there were really only two ways to make a cash income in the Arctic. One was to trap white fox, Arctic fox, and the population was crashing. And the other was basically to go into little communities and drive a bulldozer at night and get drunk during the day. And neither of those seemed to my family or to me to be very desirable outcomes. And my father listened to this and he said, well, hell, this is simple. What we'll do is we'll start a nonprofit corporation and we'll ship artifacts from the Arctic down here and we'll take them around the country and we'll develop a market and we will pay the Inuit to do these carvings, and that will give them an income, and that will enable them to buy the stuff that they need in order to survive. So here is the simple story of this is what happens when you get an entrepreneur, which is what my father was, confronted with an interesting and complicated problem, and he would say, oh, hell, this is simple. But he was able to see the entrepreneurial opportunity through the complexity of what we were trying to do. And I think as time has gone on, and as Eskimo Art Incorporated succeeded in making a market, thanks to the Smithsonian Institution and to others, gradually the recognition that there was a market which was being defined in Inuit terms rather than white man terms, was a critical issue. And that, oddly enough, got into questions of pricing. So the question arises, how do you, if you're a carver and you're out in the bush, and you want to take your carving to the guy who runs the local Hudson's Bay post, okay, what's he going to pay you for? Is he going to inflict his standards of artistic quality on your work, on which you can get a pretty good, clear idea that the usual Hudson's Bay Post manager is not going to have a degree in art criticism? And we've struggled with this question, and we finally hit on an extremely simple example, which was, we'll pay how much, proportionate to how much time you put into making this piece. And some pieces that you saw that Pat presented, the woman with the beautifully carved braids, that piece took a very, very long time to do and displays extraordinary craftsmanship. But the idea was to make the issue of the price you pay to be culturally neutral and get it out of the hands of the guys in the Hudson Bay Company and put it in the hands of the Inuit who knew better.
You know, Phil, this is really clearly a story of mutual respect, along with, mutual learning of each other. And I think it's, an instance of a positive encounter between West and North, let's say. You're bringing up all of these other ideas about the art market and how you clearly help them create this commercial enterprise. But I think I would love for you to also share this other part of the story that's also extraordinary, which is when the Inuit actually, after working with you, came to actually gain ownership of the co-ops themselves. Can you share a little bit about that part?
Well, actually, Pat and Mame are better off than I am to tell that story. But I'd like to give you 2 episodes that occurred to me while I was in the Arctic, in Dorset, which may give you a sense of what things were like a long time ago. This was in 1959. We largely lived off the land. And when you live off the land, as Mame and Pat have said, you are obliged to be sensitive to and to be entirely aware of the reciprocal responsibilities that you as a hunter have to the nature of animals and your prey, because if you don't have that respect, they won't come back. So when we would shoot a seal and tow the seal over to the shore and butcher it out, and this is done very, very carefully and precisely so that each family in the community is entitled to a specific part of the seal, and in a sense, the taking of a seal is a community benefit project rather than one that benefits solely the hunter. So we would tow the seal over to the shore and we would cut it open and we would find the liver and we would cut off a little piece of the liver and we'd all have a little taste of the liver. And then we would cut off another piece and throw it in the ocean. And that was an offering to Sedna, the sea goddess, thanking her for allowing us to harvest one of her creatures. And the little carving that you saw of Sedna, the sea goddess, is the goddess to whom we were dedicating this offering. The second story has to do with the intimacy and power of spirits. And it has to do with the story that I was told about how the great artist Niviaxiak died. He was preoccupied with bears. And years ago, I was up on Arliss II, which is an ice island about 400 miles from the North Pole. And the military had a big base there, and they were trying to figure out if the Russians were shooting off atomic bombs. But the general view was what we did was we'd feed the military there, and then we'd throw the garbage out on the ice. And the net effect was that every polar bear for about 1,000 miles came by. And I remember going from one building to the other, and there were rope connecting the building, because if you got in a whiteout and you needed to get from one building to the other, you could follow the rope. And I was going from one building to the other, and some guy said, "Watch out." And I am living proof that with a 25-yard head start, I can beat a bear over a 50-yard course. So,
all right, Phil. Well, we're glad that you did.
The Niviaxiak story is in my mind telling. Niviaxiak was preoccupied by bear and by the spirits of bear, and he dreamed about bear, and he carved bear, and he thought about bear all the time. And his friends said, "Watch out, you're getting too close to something pretty powerful here." And Niviaxiak said, "No, I'm going to keep going on this." And one day, fine day, a friend of his came up and said, "Let's go bear hunting." Okay. So they saddled up their dog teams and they went off. And they found, after a little bit, the tracks of an enormous sow bear and 2 cubs. And Niviaxiak said to his friend, and I can't attest for the truthful of this. This is the story as it was told to me. And Niviaxiak said, "Okay, you take the cubs, I'll go after the sow." Okay. And his friend chased the cubs, and the cubs jumped in the sea and went off. Niviaxiak followed the bear, and his friend followed up on the sled marks in the snow. because he couldn't find Niviaxek. And he came up over the top of a hill, and he looked down over the hill, and here in the little valley below, there is a dog team and a sled and a body lying on the snow. And Niviaxek went down to see the body. And there was no one there except for the dead body of Niviaxek. But the prince of that enormous sow bear came up to his body, and there were no prints going away. What is the conclusion? The spirit of bear got offended by Niviaxek's getting too close. Sorry.
All right. Thank you so much.
Phil, I heard that same story with a small addendum, and that was that when this was reported back in the village, back in the community, that the Royal Canadian Police was sent out to the site to see what had happened.
I never heard that.
Thinking that maybe there was a little some bad play out there, and there wasn't any. There was no evidence that Niviaxek had been hurt in any way.
Who was the prime suspect?
So when the Royal Canadian Police came back into the settlement and reported that there had been no bad playing going out there, the community took it to be, that is the proof. Even the police can't find anything other than that.
So the sense of immediacy in those days was quite profound.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think this is a lovely segue to another topic I wanted to bring up. You've brought it up already. It's so important right now, and it's the idea of climate change and how these encounters that you've had and the wonderful gift that you've given the university here can have an impact. Could you talk a little bit more? You mentioned last night about how this community can provide examples, strategies, and knowledge for the whole globe as we grapple with climate change. And I think some of your stories have contained the hints of that, about mutual respect, about what you give back, about what you're cognizant of. But I think that this is such a tight, tension-fraught moment right now for all of us, from the university out throughout the globe, on climate change. Could you speak a little bit more about what you see as the Inuit are grappling with climate change, and what you feel that we could learn from that, or model, or what you think that opportunity is for us now?
Well, I've been, both as a newspaperman and as somebody who started the Center for Michigan, I've been messing around with policy issues for quite a long time. And the biggest problem is, how do you make an otherwise abstract policy issue real? How do you demonstrate that this is not just a bunch of policy mavens running around writing articles with polysyllables all over the page, but rather how do you demonstrate that policy issues have a direct relationship on people? And now, if you think about a polar bear whose favorite food is the small seal, but the way you hunt small seals is you do so on the shore ice when they come up to their breathing holes, and you stand, being a polar bear, over the breathing hole, and when the seal comes up, you snatch the seal. Okay. That's fine as long as there is sea ice along the shore. But with climate change, the sea ice along the shore has started to go away, and the bear are now obliged to swim a fair number of miles to the places where they can find the breathing holes for the seal. So we have, in the changes of habit of animals, contingent on climate change, direct cause and effect that are beyond abstraction, but have direct meaning for an animal population and for a human population. And if we take these episodes and think about them and portray them, which is what journalists are supposed to do, then we have a sense of the embedding of the policy idea in the context and the fabric of what is going on. And then we have the possibility here at the university, in the context of the research program of a gift that our family made, to begin to raise larger issues than those involved in simply the appreciation of an extraordinary culture, but something that will wind up affecting us in a most profound possible way. And at least my instinct as I watched the kids on the campus yesterday boycotting classes, my sense is that this issue is finally an issue whose time is in the process of coming. And I think this is happening because it is becoming concrete rather than being consigned to the area of abstraction.
Phil, I'm just going to say at this moment, thank you. I know we can have more thoughts about it, but I want to leave a bit of time for Q&A with the audience. So would you all join me in a warm thank you for this presentation?
I also want to say one other thing in an academic context. You are talking with two people who know more about Inuit art than almost anybody in the world, and so the acronym is key. WGLA, World's Greatest Living Authority.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to see if I can see past the lights here. I think we have our microphones set up over here. And I don't know if we can get the slides back up, but that would be wonderful. And let's see, anyone would like to start? We have the microphones working. Over here on the right.
Oh, they're switch
Done?
over to the other room.
I was wondering if you could comment on what's being done to preserve the culture as all types of influences come in and the lifestyle changes.
Mm-hmm. Anyone want to talk? Pat?
I'll take that. The Inuit themselves started it, believe it or not, in 1970, give or take, in that there was an awful lot of colonial moves during the 60s, moving them, basically making them come into the settlements, making the kids go to school, teaching English only. But the Inuit are an incredible group of people. And so as of 1970, they formed a group in Ottawa called the ITC that was simply there to preserve the culture. Settlements such as Igloolik refused television, would not allow TV in, and also would not send their children to school unless they had a month on the land with their parents. So they themselves, I think, realized very quickly what was happening, and they started, long before we did, they started to preserve the culture, to teach the children. And it is still a very living culture. There are problems, of course, there's always problems. But as I said to you, everyone is out hunting at the current moment. The filmmakers currently who have been documenting traditional ways, right now at the Venice Biennale this year, UMMA Productions, who is a film company based in Igloolik, are doing the Canadian Pavilion, and they have done a lot with filming traditional things. The recent film was hunting a polar bear on Dog Team, which probably hasn't been done in a very long time, but they've been preserving that. The performers now and the writers are going back to mythology and promoting it. There was a play in Toronto a couple of months ago that was all in Inuktitut that had to do with mythology. So really they're leading the pack. The government is helping a lot in terms of subsidies, particularly to arts and culture. And there is also the Inuit Art Foundation, which has been around now for 31 years, which exists solely to promote, Inuit culture, not just the visual arts, although a lot of it is about visual arts, but right now, filmmaking, performance, and new media are all very important for documenting both old and what's happening today.
Maybe I could follow up with another question, Pat. Since you're in the contemporary Inuit art market, have you seen a sustainable market for contemporary artists? That's a clear question in the United States for some artists that are working in their production of art. How do you see, as a gallery owner and watching the market, how artists are able to sustain their practice today?
It is a thriving market. It's been an astounding market for years because it as early as 1960 or the 1950s, it was very popular. Currently, the switch that's happening now is it's more about individual artists. In the times of the show upstairs, it was Eskimo art, and now you have solo exhibitions for artists, and so it's now coming around to not all the artists are incredibly talented. Not all the artists in the South are incredibly talented. South is below the tree line, by the way. And so the really good artists are now standing out. And so it is, in my mind, a very strong market and an incredibly strong secondary market for the earlier pieces. Mm-hmm. So, and that secondary market will be very important as we go forward. Right now, it's all about 50s and 60s works. But as we go forward, that will move forward. So I'm very hopeful. A lot of Inuit galleries have closed, but I find that, as I say, it's an international market for sure. So it's good.
So further questions from the audience? I'm going to ask one over here on the mid left.
Slide of a boat. Oh, it was called Migration Boat. And I don't know where those people were going, but I was curious, are young people staying in the community, or if they get art training, do some of them leave and then go create works elsewhere? Are there jobs for them?
There's a growing group of urban Inuit who have moved to South and are working in the South.
Good.
And employment opportunities are not great in the North, so a lot of people, do live from their art. Carvers in Cape Dorset who sell their sculpture, the artists who sell their drawings to the co-op. So it's a combination of both, but predominantly people who come south don't tend to stay for very long, other than in Ottawa, where there's a lot of, the education levels are huge. So yes, there's a lot of policymakers, lawyers, who do operate in the South, or to work in the South for Inuit culture.
All right, I think we have time for one more. Closer to the front over here on the left.
Maybe I can just speak loudly. Mr. Powers,
Could you, we're taping this, if you could wait for the microphone, we'd appreciate it.
Mr. Powers, could you speak to what your gift of the program on Inuit art will be doing?
Say again?
Go a little.
You have given a gift for a program for Inuit art
Yes.
at this museum. Could you speak to what your vision is for
sure.
that program? Thank you.
We're at a great place in the development of this program because we're not exactly sure how to roll that snowball down the mountain. But it's plain that there is a snowball, and it's plain that there is a mountain, and there are a couple components that might be helpful. One is that we hope that the existence of this collection and the research program associated with it will have a magnetic effect on other collectors and on other collections of Inuit art in the hopes that others will say, wait a minute, there's something going on here. Let me contribute pieces of this collection to what's going on at the university. Because I believe at the present time, this program is the only program in Inuit art in American universities. Is that fair? There are ones in Canadian universities. And one of the hopes, of course, is that the program here will then establish relationships with Canadian colleagues. Mm-hmm. So, and obviously questions of research, art criticism, issues of study that are relatively traditional in any art field are going to be explored with this. But I think in the case of Inuit and Inuit art, the compelling power of the residue of an artistic tradition matched against a deteriorating climate and a deteriorating environment which has for 2,000 years sustained a fantastically successful culture is going to offer some lessons not only in anthropological studies, but it's going to offer us some lessons in today's world that unless we treat nature as we should treat Sedna and thank nature for what nature has allowing us to harvest, we're going to get ourselves into big time trouble, and we damn well better know it.
It's a very powerful statement, Phil. Thank you. We all feel that, I believe, in our hearts. And I just want to extend the idea of what we may do with this program, with this fantastic gift, what we can look forward to. You brought up one idea that the collection itself of art is going to have a magnetizing effect. It will inspire other people. It will create this kind of critical mass for study in this country. It's already brought many people out. As they've heard about it, they're sharing with the university their experiences or their art, so it does have that kind of radiating effect. But other ideas have come up, and I'd like to also throw it to you, Mame and Pat, as you've been engaging, ideas as we, develop the contours of this program and light the fire under it to achieve critical mass. What are some of the ideas that you have? Pat, you mentioned the other day of engagements with contemporary artists. One of you were talking about bringing young Inuit scholars and artists here. Can you share more about what you imagine?
I'll go first.
Go ahead.
There are programs that the Inuit Art Foundation have started in Canada for training Inuit in the cultural industries. And this will involve classroom instruction at one of the universities in Canada. But we're also looking for internship placements, and this strikes me as the perfect place for, young Inuit, well, not even necessarily young, Inuit interns to perhaps come down, work with the collection, do research. So that's certainly one area that I think would be very important. And this is such a great museum. I'm so impressed by everything that you do here, that it would be an extraordinary opportunity. And it's not just to be a curator, it could be for lighting, it could be for design, it could be for any of the functions. So that to me would be very important. And the other part of it is, as I say, with the importance of performance right now, I would think that trying to engage perhaps with the university in terms of performance, which crosses with art and in bringing back the mythology and the culture, but it would be an interesting kind of cross-pollination.
Underpinnings of the culture, right?
I don't know if you...
No, I definitely agree with what you're saying. And I'm thinking as both of you are talking that one of the things that happens with a gift like this is that it opens new possibilities. And when we were first thinking about the exhibition and how to position the exhibition, we wanted it to speak to the history of the exhibition. We wanted it to speak to your interests. We wanted it to speak also to the future, because this is very much a gift to the future. And The title of the exhibition, Tili Nungituk, it related in part, Phil, to the coming together of the story taking place in the Arctic, that story coming to your family and being addressed by your family, and those two stories twining together. This phenomenon would not have happened had that moment not happened. And this is another, I think, a kind of a pivot point where forces are coming together, and things like the idea of collaboration and internships and exchanges and bringing people here and taking people out, enabling people from here to go elsewhere, will lead some ways that we can't really even predict. I mean, that future also is a little bit like, oh, we can't anticipate totally. We can't really define what it'll be. I mean, we've got ideas like you had ideas, and those ideas came to fruition. I can just say from my own personal standpoint that having gone to school in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan and having encountered your family's collection and other collections in Ann Arbor too, opened a world to me, a world that I just could not let go, and it led to places I would never have expected to go. And I think that's one of there will be unexpected.
The unexpected will happen.
Yes. Tili Nungituk.
Okay. Any other questions or thoughts from the audience?